I grew up in a staunchly Zionist, modern Orthodox Jewish community here in the US. I'm also the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, and I'd like to examine and talk through the mechanics of how Holocaust trauma is passed down to younger Jewish generations in order to manufacture buy-in and consent to the culture and agenda of Israeli militarism. This is not a complete PhD thesis. This is just some pondering. There are two phenomena that I would like to focus on right now. The first is the very limited, the very myopic nature of Holocaust education in my community. The second is the phenomenon of what we call heritage trips to Poland that often culminate in a few days, ending the trip with a few days in Israel. So firstly, Holocaust education. I think intuitively now as an adult, I think, oh, I'm from a lineage of genocide survivors. If we're going to create curricula of genocide education, presumably you would zoom out and not just teach about the experience of your own genocide, but you would also explore the other instances of ethnic genocide across history and across the globe. My formal education placed a heavy emphasis on the Nazi Holocaust. We studied it every year. We did not study genocide globally. I mean, other than maybe a few days on Rwanda in high school, I had no formal education on ethnic cleansing across the globe. I went to a good school, right, that sends kids off to every Ivy League school. And yet I was in my late teen years walking around thinking that the word Holocaust definitionally applied to Jews. I was not taught about the Khmer Rouge's genocide of millions of Cambodians. I was not taught about the Ottoman genocide of Armenians. I was not taught about King Leopold's the nearly 10 million people exploited and murdered in the Congo by Belgian King Leopold. And, you know, yeah, we learned a little bit about the Trail of Tears, but we did not learn about the genocide of indigenous Americans. It wasn't named genocide. The Nazi Holocaust was presented to me as this unique phenomenon, utterly unparalleled and unmatched and unlike anything else across the globe and across history. And even regarding the Nazi Holocaust, we only ever talked about the 6 million Jews who were murdered. The Nazis killed almost 5 million other people, gays, Roma, disabled, other like Polish political prisoners. We didn't recite their names at our vigils on Holocaust Memorial Day. Our understanding of the Holocaust is extremely self-centered. It was mortifying to discover in my late teens, early 20s, how shallow Never Again was when I didn't even know that Holocausts had been happening and continue to happen to other communities. Theodor Herzl, the founder, the father of modern Zionism, wrote, I'm paraphrasing, but he wrote, no group in history has suffered the way the Jewish people have suffered. This is simply not true. The Jewish attachment to our own main character status as Hitler's victims completely misses the plot and completely misses the deeper lessons of this human catastrophe. Again, I'm not saying this to vilify my community, but our staggering lack of awareness and curiosity about human suffering outside of our own experience is, to me, it's like ethnic narcissism. And I don't say narcissism as like an insult. I say it as a totally non-clinical cultural diagnosis and an invitation to investigate something that is broken. The second thing I want to talk about are the heritage trips to Poland. These are run and organized by various organizations. My high school offered a heritage trip to its high school seniors for many years, where they take you to Poland for like 5 days and then you go to Israel for a few days. I didn't go when I was a senior in high school. I spent a year after high school at an Orthodox women's seminary in Jerusalem for the year, and I went on their heritage trip to Poland. These heritage trips usually consist of a cross-country tour of concentration camps, mass graves, and buildings that used to be homes to thriving Jewish life. It's a little bit like Birthright meets the Hajj, right? It's this religious pilgrimage to a site of Jewish ethnic destruction in service of cultivating a political commitment to a Jewish ethno-state in Israel. These heritage trips are a modern Jewish, almost coming-of-age rite, this ceremonial practice of re-traumatizing Jews of all ages by taking them to the actual room where it happens. Shout out Lin-Manuel. It's a pilgrimage to a literal gas chamber, to standing inside the crematoria and by mass graves as a way to sanctify and pass down what is now like the most sacred Jewish legacy, not our culture, but our suffering. These trips are considered a way to honor Jewish victims and connect with Jewish ancestry and strengthen Jewish solidarity. And they can achieve these goals, but in my experience, the trip to Poland was the single most effective mechanism for passing down and keeping Holocaust trauma alive in me. It like ignites this like pilot light inside of you of this constant awareness and this constant fear that this shit can happen again at any time. These trips are reliable generators of very real grief and tears, but they do not offer anything in the way of healing, right? There aren't debriefing, or in my experience, there weren't therapeutic debriefing sessions to grapple with the emotional legacy of the Holocaust and of survivors. There's no space to be curious about survivor behavioral patterns and family dynamics. And I had plenty of questions. How is it that my grandfather, a survivor, and his brother, how did they become estranged after an experience like that? How come there's so much screaming in my house? How come every conversation with my grandfather follows almost an identical script? Why is he so able to talk about the horrifying conditions he experienced, but he can't tell me anything about his sister who was murdered, before the war? And what's our responsibility now? Should we try to help these survivors move through their trauma, or should we just allow them and encourage them to stew in their horror stories? Is my grandfather, will he ever see himself as anything more than a survivor? And how do I mourn the fact that I might never see any other side of him? I also want to say that the state of Israel runs these trips for its high school students. So it drowns its high school students in imagery of heinous brutality against European Jewry as a way to manufacture buy-in for its militarism. I'd like to finish with just a couple of minutes reading a few diary entries from the trip that I took when I was 19 to Poland. Friday, October 16, 2009. On Wednesday, we all went on a solemn march into a forest where we stood around a mass grave. We all read testimony of survivors who were in that forest while we're spread out amongst the trees. Being in the frigid forest with the snow coming down hard was absolutely terrifying, even while it was daylight hours. I started shaking when I began to imagine being driven there in the middle of a freezing cold night, being told to strip off all my clothing and stand in a pit on top of corpses, shaking, waiting for my death to be shot. I can't fathom it. October 17th. Yesterday was a long, dreadful, painful, emotionally abusive day. We spent 4 hours in Majdanek, a concentration camp. I can't explain how I felt. There just aren't words. Honestly, in my life, I have never sobbed so intensely and felt so terrified. I realized that the torturous plight of the Jews was a slow process. I could finally visualize what happened, but I couldn't fathom how my Saba, my grandfather, physically withstood everything. I missed him so much. All I wanted to do was sit with him in his little apartment in Queens. I started to be sickened by Poland, the language and seeing it written all over. I hated that I was in Poland and not in Israel. I've just become terrified because this could happen again. Evil has merely taken on a new form. Islamic terrorism / jihad. Uh-oh! That's that sweet, sweet post 9/11 propaganda. I tried not to, but I couldn't help having visions of my whole family being taken and shot by Taliban soldiers, and the world being too worried about its own safety to care about Jews. I just know that Jews will never be safe, but the most meaningful way to live is in Israel. I will live in Israel. One more little paragraph for a little peek into the Zionist anti-Arab racism and propaganda that I was fully drunk on. We drove to Treblinka death camp. It was blizzarding and frozen. It's sickening that a place was constructed by its own victims with the sole purpose of exterminating human beings. What kind of sick, mentally corrupted monster comes up with that? How does the idea even enter one's mind? Just because I despise terrorists doesn't mean I'm going to make Arabs / Muslims build a camp and gas themselves to death. The foreshadowing. It is utterly humiliating to share this publicly, but I think essential. I talk a lot about the Jewish emotional legacy of the Holocaust as being stuck communally in a state of fight or flight, really just fight. And that when you're in that kind of emotional state, absorbing that kind of racism and hatred of another group, ironically, right, because you're the victim, your ancestors are the victim of that, ironically it becomes easy and almost intuitive to reject and fear other groups of people. I just don't see a way forward without ruthless self-critique and without honesty about ugliness that I have digested, that I'm trying to unlearn.
What the Holocaust industry is.
Basically, it's the exploitation of the colossal suffering of Jews during World War II for political and then for a certain period financial gain. The political gain was basically using the Nazi Holocaust as a club to silence criticism of Israel. And at some point, this Holocaust compensation racket, the extraction of monies from European governments in the name of what were called needy Holocaust victims, began. And several, I think the figure comes now to about $20 billion, were coerced from European governments, mostly on fraudulent grounds. And then there was all of this schlock nonsense, which basically is used to defend Israel and deflect criticism of Israeli policy. You can usually tell this literature because it asserts or insists on the absolute uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust, the claim that no people in the history of humanity have ever suffered the way Jews suffered. And that's clearly an ideological claim. You can't intellectually prove things like that, and it's almost absurd to want to prove them. The purpose is fairly straightforward. That is, if people have uniquely suffered, then they can't be held to conventional moral and legal standards. So, for example, if you say that Israel tortures Palestinian detainees, well, then you're told, remember the Holocaust. Or if you're told that Israel illegally demolishes the homes of Palestinians, you're told, remember the Holocaust. The point being that because Jews suffered uniquely, it somehow excuses these, by any other standard, crimes.
Did you know there was relatively little Holocaust education in America until 1967, when the country that shall not be named started a war with all of its neighbors in a preemptive strike, destroying Egypt's military in a few minutes and then attacking everyone else? So after the 1967 war, when they proved that they were not a weak country and that they could destroy everyone around them and were willing to, and they had started and won several battles and wars up until then, The 1970s was a blossoming of Holocaust education in America. And it was in that shift when the country over there started saying there's going to be a second Holocaust and we're all going to be annihilated again. That's why we need to defend ourselves and attack first. The narrative in America went from Jewish survival and resistance and changed to Jewish victimhood. You can read more about that in this book, The Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein, who is a Jewish man whose parents both survived the Holocaust, and he's been called a self-hating Jew and an anti-Semite and all of the things that they like to throw at people. It's a pretty controversial book because his whole thesis is that the Holocaust became an industry, a money-making business. And if you haven't figured out yet, this is the only way that I can get videos out in the algorithm is to use a TikTok shop link. And I don't care if you buy it from me or not. The commission is few and far between anyways. But I don't get views on any other videos. So I talk about my book, Young Men Go West, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and my grandfather's escape. There are 3 things for it on my treehouse.
Sometimes the CIA will actually have news articles retracted that they think is a threat for national security, and other times they'll actually release documents that they previously had retracted. News clipping on Israel was actually approved for release back in 2004. It's all about just how insane the Israeli propaganda machine is. This section on the Israeli lobby especially is pretty insane. First off, the whole article talks about how it's in Israel's best interest for Americans to view Arabs as barbaric and hostile. A member of Congress decided to withhold support for an issue desired by the lobby. Telegram phone calls immediately start pouring in from contributors, campaign workers, and others expressing their concern. The Israeli lobby is very organized, smart, and constantly alert. They'll keep putting pressure on these politicians until they finally crack, and the best way to do that is by making these politicians feel guilty for not supporting a small nation surrounded by hostile Arabs. Maintaining this underdog image for Israel is so important in the media. It's mainstream in media to portray Israel as this victim and Arabs unfavorably. Journalists will continue to keep this image, feeling that they'll be subjected to ridicule if they don't. The Israeli lobby has done a great job of making sure Americans see news coverage of acts committed by Palestinians. Where was this coverage when Israel terrorized and bombed Lebanon in the 1970s because they wanted their water supply? Let's not forget that the Israeli lobby starts this propaganda at a very early age with organizations like the Institute for Curriculum Services that's whole point is to lobby history textbook companies to write a positive image of Israel and a negative one of the Arabs. Overall, I would just say be vigilant of it and notice just how much Israeli propaganda you're being fed.
But being vocally critical and disloyal to the project of the State of Israel is heretical where I come from. Is deeply offensive to my community, to my family, and I've been told a number of times I'm a disloyal Jew, I'm a bad Jew, I'm not a real Jew. Which is so crazy because I did do a 23andMe test and it did come back 96% Ashkenazi Jew, which I don't know if you know is like medically inbred. Something that's tough is I'm a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, and that gets thrown in my face a lot. Like, how, as a grandchild, a descendant of someone who survived a genocide, how could you possibly accuse your own people of a genocide? So I want to say 2 things. The first is that surviving abuse does not disqualify you from the capacity to abuse. Most abusers are themselves survivors of abuse. Suggesting that a Jewish nationalized military is somehow incapable of the crime of genocide because they are the descendants of survivors of genocide is not honest or coherent. The other thing I want to say that is actually pretty difficult to talk about and hold and reckon with myself is that my own grandparent, who did survive Nazi concentration camps, was a staunch lover of the State of Israel, was so deeply proud of my family members who served in the Israeli military. It is difficult to sit with the fact that I call the State of Israel an illegitimate project when my own grandfather, who went through unspeakable horrors that I will never know, when he was like, no, that's a good idea. So I've wrestled with this, like, am I disrespectful of my own ancestor because we don't have the same vision for Jewish safety? He's the one with the proximity to experiencing violent persecution. What do I know? I'm a rich Jewish girl from New Jersey. Something that's been really illuminating to me, discovering that there are survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, of European Jewry, who are vehemently stand against or just do not believe, have a totally different worldview than the Zionist worldview. Discovering that gave me a little push to reflect on my own grandparent and consider, I wonder why he thought the things he thought. And I can't have a conversation with him about it because he's no longer alive. But the more I think about it, even if he was still living, or even if my views had crystallized while he was still in my life, I don't know that we would have had a fruitful conversation about it. Because the more I think about my grandfather, the more clarity I see him with. You know, he survived, but he was broken. He was a man who could very easily speak about his experience, about the atrocities that he witnessed. But he was not someone who could have open-ended conversations. Every conversation we had was almost an identical script. They were so repetitive. Every week we would talk on the phone and it would just be the same conversation over and over again. He was stuck. He was stuck in survival mode, in fight or flight. That is the state. That is the emotional state that my entire family inherited from him, which makes sense. But a ruthless, uncompromising Zionist ideology can only be held when you live in that intense state of survival. That when you're shown a picture of a emaciated Palestinian man dying in real time, collapsing from starvation, and your first reaction is, well, what's the real story behind here? I mean, who was that guy? And, you know, maybe he was Hamas. When that's your initial response, as opposed to your heart just breaking, witnessing a man die in real time because of man-made starvation, you are not in an emotional state where you can access your compassion freely. It's that you can't afford to be abundant and indiscriminate with your humanity because you fully believe that you are under attack. I'm not under attack. I grew up rich in New Jersey. Okay, well, what if you're not from New Jersey? What if you're Israeli and you actually are under attack? The state of Israel does not get to claim it is under attack. It is a project founded on stolen land, maintained and enforced through brutal military occupation. You're not attacked randomly. You stole someone's home, your boot is on their neck. You think they're not going to fight back? Are you insane? We are high off of the adrenaline of living in fight or flight mode, and the fetishization of Jewish victimhood has eclipsed any sort of room on our agenda for literal emotional restoration and healing. Some people came out and healed, mazel tov. Lots of us came out of that experience and passed on that fear to our children, and we live in that today, to our own detriment and to the absolute detriment and decimation of the Palestinian people. Not to mention Syria, Lebanon. The State of Israel, the biggest group project in Jewish history, is a perfect illustration of Jewish failure to process trauma. Basically, yeah, sure, call me a fake Jew, tell me I'm being rude to my grandfather. You're hurting and you're not dealing with it. And it is erasing an innocent group of people. Jewish pain and trauma are real and valid, but they are not a hall pass for violence. If we can't grieve and recover and validate our own pain without doing violence to our neighbor, what are we doing?
I'm Jewish enough for a free trip to Israel, and in my early 20s, I went to Israel. And right when I got off the plane, people told me, you could become a citizen within 24 hours. You're Jewish enough. You should move here. What I didn't know is that when Israel became a state, I thought that all of the governments just gave Jewish people money to buy houses. They bought out Palestinians, and the neighborhoods naturally segregated. Not that people were held by gunpoint, not that people were killed in the streets, not that people have the keys to their house that they can't even walk by anymore. I didn't understand that it's just textbook colonization that took place, with ending up in open air prison because people can't even leave the neighborhood they're forced into. That's equal to or worse than a concentration camp. I didn't understand, and they almost got me. I'm ethical as fuck and they almost got me. Jews need to start talking about birthright trip. Any American or European right now can go to Israel for free on a trip off of whose money and go tour Israel to move there in stolen houses. I apologize for my ignorance. Me and my Jewish friends have talked. I'm not friends with people who believe in this ideology. It's racism. I recently had a rabbi's wife call me over and over again because she heard I was in town. My husband speaks out against Palestine, and she wanted to convert me into her world. I told her I don't practice Judaism and we won't be good friends, but she wouldn't stop calling and texting me because she wanted to convert me because I have good blood. In which I say, fucking yuck. I'm not friends with people based on their blood. We're not preserving a culture. I don't practice that culture. That's just racial. It's just racist. And what's happening in Gaza is worse than the Holocaust. Concentration camps suck. Prison camps suck. This open air prison that's multi-generational, it's gotta go.
Where this is in the middle of Tel Aviv. These are Iron Dome launchers in the middle of Tel Aviv, surrounded by residential apartment buildings. Also, the Israeli military's HQ is in the middle of Tel Aviv, surrounded by residential apartment buildings. Tell me again, how many times over the past 20 months have we heard that Hamas is using residential areas as military bases, right? Hospitals, schools, all of that. How they're embedding themselves within the civilian population, using them as human shields. How many times have we heard that? They have been using that shit as an excuse to flatten Gaza this whole time. By their standards, those targets in Tel Aviv are legitimate military targets. You can't have it both ways, right? And if you're watching all of this unfold and you're freaking out and you're going, oh, pray for Israel, but you haven't been praying for Gaza over the past 20 months, you need to ask yourself some serious fucking questions. Why is it that when you see white Israelis being subject to the same shit that Gazans have been subjected to for almost 2 years now is the time that you freak out. Now is the time that you start feeling bad. It's just straight up disgusting, and you should feel ashamed of yourselves, honestly.
Talking about the birthright trip where every Jewish person can go to Israel for free to go date, go to bars, fall in love, join the IDF, and move to Israel. It's a free trip offered to every Jew. People are very disturbed that I am comparing what is happening in Gaza to the Holocaust. I'm even having people respond, have you ever been to a Holocaust museum? You don't understand. Well, guess what? There's no Nakba museum. Nobody's funding information to teach us about the oppression happening in Palestine because we are actively funding the oppression. We're funding the genocide. Our tax dollars are paying for it. When I went to church, a lot of people in my community wouldn't even shop at the local farm stands and co-ops because money might be donated to Gaza, which could hurt God's chosen people from getting their land. We have allowed this language to exist for too long. There's no such thing as God's chosen people. We are all chosen by God. We are all gods. We are all made in the same image. Christ came to dismantle an elitist ideology. The propaganda is very thick and the money lies with Zionists. Jewish people don't even compare what's happening in Gaza to the ghettos they lived in Europe. They are claiming 100% of the oppression and taking no accountability for the oppression they are dishing. What is happening in Gaza is far worse than the ghettos Jewish people lived in. It's multi-generational oppression. There are war crimes of starvation, people having surgeries without anesthesia. We're not allowed to compare it to the Holocaust. Why aren't we allowed to do that? I think the Holocaust is being used to lampshade the oppression and genocide going on right now. We can't be committing a genocide. We're the victims of a genocide. You absolutely can be. You are.
זה שוליים של השוליים שלא רוצים. יש כאלה אומרים לא עכשיו, זה לא העיקר, אלה לא...
I really don't know what's gonna like radicalize people more, but this is insane. There are almost 1 million illegal Israeli settlers living off of your taxes, by the way. Unemployed, on illegal land, internationally recognized illegal land settlements, using your money, your taxes, the, I don't know, $40, $50 that come out of your paycheck, going straight to Israel. Yeah. It also means that we could hypothetically have 1 million unemployed Americans just fucking about for their entire lives, having kids, living in homes, having healthcare, affording food. But no, they get it. I'm unemployed. I don't pay taxes. I would be really pissed off right now if I was you. And with that anger, I would boycott, divest, and sanction Israel so that they lose the money and you get your money back. Fuck Israel.
I'm Jewish, and as a result, the state of Israel will literally give me an all-expenses-paid vacation to come visit. And on this trip, they will plant IDF soldiers who will also get to enjoy this vacation, with the purpose of, one, humanizing the soldiers who are carrying out their violent colonialism, but also, I don't know, maybe I'll find one of them attractive and we'll hook up and settle down and I'll get to marry an Israeli. Also, as a benefit of my Jewishness, if I wanted an Israeli citizenship, I could get it like that. And not only will I be a citizen of the state of Israel, but the government will literally give me the money, resources, and weapons to go to the West Bank and steal a Palestinian's home. And if I happen to kill a Palestinian while doing that, the punishment I will get will be like barely a slap on the wrist. But if a Palestinian literally has the keys to the home that their family has lived in for hundreds of years, that is meaningless in the eyes of Israel. And if a Palestinian child throws a rock at the tank that is currently rolling through their town that the bulldozers just demolished, they will be arrested and held indefinitely with no trial. So I can't imagine why people would call Israel an ethno-state built on the idea of Jewish supremacy.
After house, all this area will be a Jewish neighborhood. We are not finished the job. We are going to the next neighborhood, and after that we will go more. Our dream that all East Jerusalem will be like West Jerusalem, Jewish capital of Israel. אני רואה בזה המשך של המפעל היהודי-ציוני, המשך שיבת ציון, זה הכל. זה בא על חשבון הערבים? כן, גם בג"ץ והכנסת בנויים על חשבון ערבים, וגם המדינה כאן הוקמה, כן, על חשבון חלק מהתושבים הערבים שגרו פה. וזהו.
Many Palestinian children were walking to school. Suddenly, we heard tear gas being fired. The Israeli army told us it was in response to stone throwing. We couldn't confirm this, but we saw these Israeli police assembling. Then they fired tear gas towards the children. We saw no provocation from the children who were trying to avoid the gas. The teachers said tear gas was fired here almost every day.
Every day like this.
And why do you think the Israelis do it?
They thought that protect their settlements, but we want to study our children. In the last week, we take 3 to the hospitals from the gas.
How are you? You speak English? We approached the police.
We're from Australian television.
We cannot talk with you.
No. But can I just ask one thing? Excuse me. We've just been standing here now. Why did you fire the tear gas towards those children going to school?
We can't talk to you. We cannot talk to you. Thank you.
No, but they appear to be children going to school normally. Can I ask you why you fired this and the other tear gas at them?
What is
To get to school each day, these children need to walk past this settler outpost. Attacks from settlers have become so bad that the army escorts the children, and the army has not turned up. Today, the children are on their own. Their only protection is this Israeli volunteer who hopes by carrying a camera he will deter settlers.
How do you feel, though? You're a Jewish Israeli. How do you feel about this?
I can't describe this in words because I feel myself as partly a Holocaust survivor because my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. He was partisan. He ran away for a few years and all his family died in the Holocaust. And I don't get it how from one who was suffering from all those stuff, we became people that are making other people suffering for our behavior. It's break me. It's really break me.
The biblical rights, which have absolutely no status, none. Nobody in the world can say 2,000 years ago, here's my story of what happened, so therefore I have a right to do it now. You can't live in a world like that. Nobody in the world ever makes such a claim. You want to make it, okay, but then just admit, I'm out of the world. I'm distinct from the world. Now, yes, totally distinct. If you really want to play that game, the Palestinians have more of a right to claim to be descendants of the population from 2,000 years ago than I do. My ancestors probably come from the Caucasus. Their ancestors come from Palestine. The Canaanim were correct about this. So you don't want to get into that game. Biblical rights have no status.
And in fact, if you go back and read the literature on the creation of Israel, this is all thoroughly documented. Ethnic cleansing was a subject that the Zionists talked about from the get-go, and they talked about extensively, because there was no way they could create a greater Israel without doing massive ethnic cleansing. You want to remember that when the Zionists come to Israel, starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there are remarkably few Jews in Palestine. And those Jews are not Zionists. The Zionists are the Jews who come from Europe.
Right.
And they understand that they're moving into a territory that's filled with Palestinian villages and Palestinian people. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how can you create a Jewish state on a piece of territory that's filled with Palestinians without doing ethnic cleansing, massive ethnic cleansing? And the answer is you can't. So they're talking about and thinking about ethnic cleansing from the get-go. So the idea that they wouldn't think of what the situation looks like after October 7th is an opportunity to do ethnic cleansing, you know, it belies.
So it wasn't really a land without people for a people without land.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Why does the United States support Israel? Well, there's a history, and a very interesting one. One thing to remember is that Christian Zionism is a very powerful force, which goes back long before Jewish Zionism. Woodrow Wilson was a devout Christian who read the Bible every day. So did Harry Truman. In the Roosevelt administration, one of the leading officials, Harold Ickes, once described the return of the Jews to Palestine as the greatest event in history. It's realizing the lesson of the Bible. These are deeply religious countries in which the biblical commands, so-called, are taken quite literally. Also, this is just part of colonization. This is the last phase of European colonization. And notice that the countries that are most strongly in support of Israel are not just the United States. It's the United States, Australia, and Canada, the offshoots of England, Anglosphere sometimes called, unusual forms of imperialism. These are settler colonial societies. There are also significant geostrategic factors. You go back to 1948, there was actually a split between the State Department and the Pentagon in the United States over how to react to the new state of Israel. The State Department was not committed strongly to Israeli conquests, the establishment of the state, and was concerned about the refugees. It wanted an implementation of the refugee problem. The Pentagon, on the other hand, was very impressed with Israel's military potential. The Israeli military successes If you look back at the internal record and declassified, the Joint Chiefs of Staff described Israel as the second largest military force in the region after Turkey and a potential base for U.S. power in the region. That continued. Israel performed a major service to the United States by destroying a secular Arab nationalism, a major enemy of the United States, and supporting radical Islam, which the U.S. supported. And it continues right until the present. Right now, we saw an example of that just during the latest Gaza attack. You recall that at one point, Israel began to run out of munitions during the assault, despite the fact that it's armed to the teeth. The United States provided Israel with additional munitions through the Pentagon. And notice where they were taken from. These were U.S. munitions pre-positioned in Israel for eventual use by U.S. forces. One of many signs of how Israel is regarded as essentially a military offshoot of the United States. As for Palestine, I've been there pretty often. I think Israel's for 50 years has been carrying out an illegal, brutal occupation, totally in violation of international law and Security Council resolutions. The U.S. has been providing the arms. If you read the Israeli press, Haaretz, the main newspaper, every day there's another crime in the West Bank. Gaza, of course, which I've also visited, is just a miserable prison and a punching bag for Israel. And they feel like it. They do what they call mowing the lawn, just let's bomb and kill a lot of civilians and hit the hospitals and so on and so forth. There's 1 million children, 2 million population, about 1 million children in Gaza. They can't get potable water. Even that, the power stations destroyed, sewage stations destroyed. Fishermen aren't allowed to go out more than a couple of kilometers, which means they can't fish because of the pollution. It's just a horror story. But the West Bank, too, it's just daily crimes, what they call the settlers, the hilltop youth, the IDF, the armies watching them. Palestinians try to protect themselves. The Palestinians are attacked. It's about the only place that resembles it right now, I think, is Kashmir, also occupied by India illegally, imposed and sending Indian settlers and so on, very much on the Israeli model. Well, if blacks in the United States excluded from roughly 90% of the territory by a variety of laws and administrative procedures, I would call it white supremacy. That's the way Israel has been since its origins. If there were large-scale funding in the United States for white settlements, development of white areas, but nothing for black settlements and black areas, I'd call it white supremacy. It's not the case that even within Israel's own boundaries, Jews and Palestinians are treated equally. You can't even have Israeli citizenship. And if you're Palestinian, you're deprived of many rights in all sorts of ways. That's a form of Jewish supremacy, just as it would be white supremacy in the United States.
The State of Israel was founded by terrorists. No, this is not hyperbole. No, this is not a metaphor. The State of Israel was founded by terrorist groups. Before Israel's founding in 1948, there were 3 main Zionist paramilitary groups. These were known as the Haganah, the Lehi, and the Irgun. It was these 3 paramilitary organizations that merged together and later became what we now know as the IDF, or Israeli Defense Forces. It was these 3 paramilitary groups who were designated as terrorist organizations by both the UK and the United Nations that would become responsible for implementing Plan Dalet, the blueprint for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In July of 1938, the Irgun bombed 2 vegetable markets in Haifa and Jerusalem, respectively, killing 80 people in total. In July of 1946, the Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. Also in 1947, the Lehi tried sending letter bombs to the White House to try and assassinate President Truman for not supporting their efforts to build a Jewish state in Palestine. In January of 1948, the Haganah bombed the Semiramis Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 25 people. In April of 1948, both the Irgun and Lehi attacked the village of Deir Yassin and massacred over 110 Palestinians. And in September of 1948, the Lehi assassinated a man who rescued 31,000 people from a Nazi concentration camp in World War II, including over 500 Jews, Folk Bernadotte, a United Nations mediator who the Lehi accused of having a pro-Arab stance during the ceasefire negotiations at the end of 1948. The leader of the Haganah, David Ben-Gurion, became Israel's first prime minister. The leader of the Irgun, Menachem Begin, became Israel's sixth prime minister from 1977 until 1983. And the leader of the Lehi, Yitzhak Shamir, would become Israel's seventh prime minister from 1983 until 1984, and from 1988 until 1992.